Okay, BCA-101. This is day 34. It's a Wednesday, 4/12/17. Alright, and we're working on security, and we're just starting databases. And I made reference to section 6.4, the hacking, and where to do the discussion on that. Alright, so the first thing we did, we see if there's any questions. Then we talked about, they had an excerpt on 60 Minutes. It would have been Sunday before this Wednesday. And they talked about smartphone use. And they had three individuals. They had a guy that used to work for Google, and he talks about how the algorithms are getting to the point where they're not ethical, gathering so much information. The phones really are you're really being used when you use your phone, and then the abundance of use for the phones, of what they do to make you keep coming back. There was a whole section on that. And, you know, they're an attention merchant. The phones are, in which you're really the product, and they're selling you to the advertisers. We also talked about young kids and their parents spending a lot of time on devices rather than spending time with their kids, or ignoring their kids because they're on their device. Something to think about. This section we'll talk about in a little bit. We talked about authentication. Now, authentication is some way to identify who you are. Now, some people say, well, it's passwords, but it's really a number of things. So it can be something you know, user ID, password, some cases maybe an address, something you know, okay? Could be something you are, like your fingerprint, or some will read your eyes. Some places will weigh you and look at your height. It's something you are that identifies you. The most common is your fingerprint. Then it's something you have. Key card or debit card. So a debit card would be something you have and something you know to authenticate you. And nowadays it's good to do two-factor authentication. So when you authenticate with one of these things, then it sends a message to your phone. Your phone will have a code. Then you'll enter the code, and then it'll identify who you are. So for somebody to hack into that, they'd have to first of all get some of this information. And then when they log in, they'd also have to have your phone. And they'd have to be able to open your phone, find the code from your phone in order to get in. Everybody should start using this. Alright, once you're in, then we talk about what you're authorized to do, and then most systems audit you and keep accounting of what you're doing. This is huge, right? Facebook, Google, all these places monitor exactly where you are and what you do, and they tie it back to your identity. So then they can advertise pop-ups to you that are things you're interested in. Alright. Now, we talked about data that's being stored, data that's in transit, and data that's being processed. Those three states of data. How do we protect it? You can encrypt data and then decrypt it. You can encrypt it while it's stored on a hard drive, while it's in transit. Typically not while it's being processed. But you can encrypt it, and then when you need to use it, you can decrypt it. So we have this whole idea of encryption. Now, hashing is another thing. You can take your data and create, let's say this is your data here. You can take this data, whatever it is, and you can hash it into this set size, and uses an algorithm to do that, to hash it to that size. Then if you, as an example, if you send this data somewhere through the internet, it comes out somewhere else, then you can take this data and hash it again, send the hash with it, hash it again, and then compare the two hashes. Compare this hash to this one. If they're the same, the data didn't change. Another place we use hashes are for passwords. Passwords are stored by a hash. Then when you type in the new password, it hashes it, and then it compares the two hashes. Okay? So nobody can just look and see what your password is. We'll keep moving here. So then if we look at the big picture, we authenticate who we are. We authorize what we can do, okay, based on our authentication. It's a good idea to do two-factor authentication. And then they keep track, wherever you are, of what you're doing. They audit and accounting. So sometimes they'll talk about AAA in terms of authenticate, authorize, and accounting or auditing people as they use any electronic devices. Okay? And we talked a little bit here about securing. Now, let's take a look at an example. We did this in class. If Scott is going to send some transmission to Brandon, okay, so he wants to send this data to Brandon, and we want it secure, so nobody can read it, and then we want to ensure integrity. Okay, so secure, integrity, accurate, and authenticate who it came from. So let's take a look at that. This is an interesting process. So first of all, we can create a concept known as public and private key. Public key you can share, the private key you never share. Okay? So here's how that works. If you encrypt with one, you can only decrypt with the other. So if you encrypt with your public key, you can only decrypt it with a private key. So here's what we can do. Here's the process. Brandon can send Scott his public key. Scott can encrypt the data with the public key and send the data to Brandon. Then Brandon is the only one that can decrypt it because he's the only one that has the private key. So the data was secured in sending it to Brandon. Now we need to authenticate who it came from, so we can authenticate and make sure it's accurate, both in the same step. So what we can do is, Scott has a public and private key. So Scott can take the data, he can hash it, and then encrypt it with his private key. Then he can send that over and send over his public key. So when it gets on the other end, Brandon's got the data, he decrypts it, then he can take and hash it and then encrypt the hash and compare them to see if it actually came from Scott. Alright, because Scott will send his public key so he can decrypt it. Cool. We'll talk more about that. We can talk more about that later on. So, when you buy something from Amazon, we'll talk about that at the end. Last thing to talk about here are databases. Query and query a database, pull information out that we need. The database holds data, and we pull it out and create information. What does it hold? Bits, right? Bunch of ones and zeros. That represents an A. Group a bunch of characters together. They're ones and zeros. We might get a name, Mike Dirksen. Can add a social security number, primary key that identifies just Mike Dirksen. We can have birth date that identifies Mike Dirksen. And later on we'll talk about putting this information into a table. Put tables together into files. Group the files together into a database. Alright, so the last thing I want to mention here. If you were going to buy something through the internet, let's say from Amazon, there has to be some type of private-public key exchange so that when you send the information in, it's secured, so it's encrypted, and it's also verified that it's coming from you. Okay? And so when it gets here, they can decrypt it, get you the information, use your credit card, and of course then the same thing occurs. They'll get their money from the bank, and that all has to be done secured too. And then they'll confirm your order. Let's just see. Okay, and then they ship it. Right? They use their drone. Your drone flies over, dumps it off at your house. Sort of like that. Alright, that's it for today.